I have a Dogman story for you. This is a tale my gramps told me a few years ago, after I had my own Dogman encounter. I'll start with mine, and then I'll go into his. We live in Oklahoma, and my grandpa was born and raised in the Ozarks. After he retired, he ended up buying a small cabin that he wanted to spend the rest of his years in. One night, while I was going out to spend the weekend with him, I witnessed a very tall, hairy, bipedal wolfman run across the road and into the tree line on the other side. This thing only took about 2 steps and cleared the entire road. Its fur was shaggy and dark brown or black, and I'd put it at about 8 feet tall, judging by how tall the branches of the trees were that he ran into. It had a long, canine muzzle, and I'm pretty positive its legs were bent backwards like a dog. I damn near crapped my pants at what I had just seen. Needless to say, I didn't stop to investigate this thing either. I drove faster. Once I got to my gramps' place, I ran into the house and locked the door behind me, looking out the window to see if there were any monsters outside. He was confused and curious as to why I was so upset, and I told him what I had just seen. To my shock, he nodded and said, "So, you saw the wolfman too." All I could do was blink at him over and over. I had no idea what was going on, and I asked him what he was talking about, and what it was that I saw. He shrugged. "Not sure, but I've seen that thing a few times now." He sat down at his table and motioned for me to do the same. "I'll tell you all about it if you want." I sat down to listen. The first story he told me was when he had first moved into the cabin after he retired. Now keep in mind, he worked construction up until he was 66 years old, and this was only 2 years after that. So he'd been seeing this thing for 2 years. Anyways, when he first moved into that house, he was out in the woods and found a deer carcass that was pretty mangled. And it was missing its head. He said it looked like a wild animal really went to town on this thing, but taking the head isn't something an animal usually does. The thought of a poacher crossed his mind, thinking maybe they killed the deer, messed it up like that, and took its head as a trophy. But why waste the meat? Regardless, he didn't go into the forest without his gun from then on. A few weeks later, he was driving back to his place after going to visit his brother, when he, too, saw this thing run across the road. At this point, he leaned in across the table towards me. Except, when I seen him, he was carrying a whole deer over his shoulder, and running like it was no burden at all. He leaned back in his chair and described the exact same creature I saw, and I felt chills. He told me he went out the next day where it ran across the road and found huge prints, like a dog, but way too big to be a dog. He decided against looking further into the woods and went back home. A few nights later, he saw it again, only this time it was on his own property. He said it was right after sunset, so he could still somewhat see outside, and he had gone out to get some fresh air and smoke his old pipe. That's when he saw something he couldn't identify. He told me it was sniffing around his truck at the driver's side door, and at this point it was on all fours, just sniffing like he was trying to find something that he already knew was there. My grandpa leaned in again and looked me right in the eyes as he continued his story. "Then the damnedest thing happened," he said. "That thing stood up on 2 legs and looked inside the truck, with both of its front hands pressed against it. It stared inside for a minute and then walked on 2 legs to the bed of the truck. He said he was terrified that it would get tired of the truck and head towards the door of his house. But it never did. It seemed that it lost interest and went back into the woods. The next time he saw this thing on his property, it was standing in the trees, like it was watching something. Gramps stared at it from his porch, not wanting to make any noise that would alert it to him. He said he knew that thing knew he was there, though. It just didn't care, because it was too interested in whatever it was that it was watching. He told me the next day he was outside in the woods looking for firewood, and found a rabbit, or at least what resembled a rabbit, all ripped up. The scariest part of this story is that he's seen it so many times after that. He's seen it on the road going towards his house 4 or 5 times since then. Every single time he's seen it on the road, it's been at night. Sometimes you can find footprints, like huge dog or wolf prints, but too big to be either. He said the footprints are even bigger than his. Occasionally, he'll come across carcasses of its kills, usually a deer or rabbit, but there's several times when he's found cats all torn up and eaten. Twice he's heard what he calls unearthly, ungodly screams or howls from what he thinks is the Dogman. He told me what he heard sounds like the werewolf from an American Werewolf in London. I asked him why he still stays out here if he knows this thing is out there too, and he told me he feels as long as he leaves it alone, it'll do the same to him. I asked if he was scared of it, and he shrugged. Told me that he isn't scared, but he isn't going to seek it out either. He respects it, and that's what keeps him safe from it. This was all too much for me, and I stood up, pacing around the house. My grandpa chuckled and told me I didn't have to worry about the wolfman. Yeah, right, I thought. I didn't get a wink of sleep that night because I was too scared that this thing was going to come into the house and eat me. Gramps found it amusing, but I was pretty annoyed. The next morning I said goodbye and drove back home, keeping my eyes open for this thing. But I didn't see it again. I've been out there to visit Gramps a bunch of times since then, and I have never encountered it again. But he says it's still out there, because he still sees it from time to time. I hope I never see it again. Well, where do you start with something like this? I'm not doing this for any other reason other than to truthfully tell what I've seen. There's been other things that have happened in the course of the last 17 years that could be connected with this incident, but they're nothing more than speculation of my own on this subject. I suppose I should tell you a little bit about myself. I'm 59 years old. I've hunted and spent a lot of time in the woods. I'm efficient with long guns, pistols, and bows. And back when I was a much younger man, I enjoyed spending time outdoors. Sneaking up on deer was a joy to me. I always got a kick out of what a challenge it was. I'm not uncomfortable alone in the outdoors, and my encounter with this creature was not a fear-filled one, rather curious and a thing of wonder. I mean, how often do you see such a thing standing in your own yard in the bright afternoon sun? It was a warm, comfortable, enjoyable day, and there was no reason for concern. In the early part of 2017, I came home in my pickup truck, parked in my driveway, and got out of the truck. I started down the path to my trailer at the well pump, and I looked up. There, about 200 feet from where I was standing, there stood a creature that was between 7 and 8 feet tall, and was covered in short hair, but it had the face of a dog. The body resembled that of a man, though, and it was built like a refined bodybuilder. The legs were without mistake, just like a dog's, only this thing was standing on its back legs only. The arms were well defined too, long and muscular. It had a set of hands that had long claws. The torso was well muscled with broad shoulders, and the neck seemed to be short. The color of this dogman was dark, but not black, maybe somewhere between gray and black, and the ears were more on the side of its head rather than the top. I had a side view, so no eye contact, and this thing was just looking into the woods. It never made a sound either. The area where I live has a lot of different animals: deer, fox, coyotes, every kind of bird from turkeys to sparrows, all kinds of snakes. But what was odd about that day? The woods were dead quiet, not a sound. No barking dogs, no chirping birds, none of the usual noises. The creature was standing sideways to my view, and it was looking back into the woods from where it was standing on my grass. It was looking in a southwest direction. This is important for another reason. That'll be another part of my story. It never once turned to notice me. I didn't smell any bad odor. I suppose the wind was strong enough to carry it from me. But I have on occasion gone outside and been hit with this awful smell that isn't too familiar with my nostrils. This thing looked like a pure killing machine. There was no doubt in my mind it could take care of whatever trouble it got into. Another thing that struck me odd was how active the coyotes were over the last week or so, just before my encounter. Way more than normal. After standing there for some time, this dogman just took off at a speed that seemed unreal to me. almost like it phased out of my ability to see it anymore. I saw it start taking off, and then it was just gone. After that, I got on the net and tried to search about what I'd seen. My oldest son got me using YouTube for lots of different subjects, and I felt this would be a way that I could definitely find something. I ran across a few sites. I made comments, asking what it was, and talking about the safety of my grandkids that come over and play. I got a reply from a woman who lives in the next state over and seems to know a lot about the subject of Sasquatch and Dogman. I suppose I should mention also a few other things. In the late part of 2016, a friend that lives on the country road next to mine saw something too. After that, he asked me, "Have you seen anything odd in the woods lately?" That struck me as odd, because the question came out of nowhere. And this man, he hunts. He's good with any kind of firearm you stick in his hands. He's lived here his whole life, and I trust him. So him asking such a thing had weight to it. At that time, nothing came to mind, because I hadn't had my encounter yet. But another thing that happened that year was I was outside in the middle of the night, standing by my pump, smoking a cigarette, and all of a sudden, from the tree line, not more than 50 feet, comes a deep growling that took me by surprise, to say the least. It shook the inside of my chest in a way that reminded me of a ZZ Top concert I went to when I was younger. The bass of it just shook me like a leaf inside. I flipped my smoke and went in surprised, but not necessarily afraid. What it was, I don't know. I heard it, but I didn't see it. There were times at night you would hear something running in the woods, fast and heavy, and definitely on two legs. It was moving fast, and the steps had length to them that you couldn't miss. There have been a lot of odd sounds over the years. Some of them I would catch myself pondering after hearing them. Months later, after my encounter, my wife had an encounter of her own. Now, I've had the privilege of being married to the same woman for 39 years. And I must say, after 6 kids and that many years, you know that person very, very well. I can say, I have not in all those years caught her lying to me. I've seen her bend things to keep the kids out of being punished, but right out lying? No way. She and our son, who's 20 years old, were coming back from work at dusk, and they were about 1/4 of a mile or so from where I'd seen the Dogman in the backyard. That night, she walks in as pretty as you please and says, "I just seen a Bigfoot walking in the light brush along the road heading into the woods." It was still light enough because it was the summer months, and she could see it good, so I started asking her about it. I wanted to make sure it was what she thought she saw, so I started asking her questions about it. She tells me all there was to tell, and sure enough, sounds like a Bigfoot to me. Definitely something different than what I had encountered. She told me it blended in with the background, and it was huge, just walking along in the thicket growth and the trees next to the road. The legs were straight. She said it had long arms, and it was just as big. But she never got a good look at the head. But also, the way the growth is along those roads, I can understand why. We have a lot of thick undergrowth and trees that could block a view from this thing. Then I remembered what I heard about Sasquatch and Dogman from the woman that I was telling you about. Where you see one, you'll probably see the other. Then I thought about what direction the Dogman was looking, and it was in the same direction that they'd seen the Sasquatch in. I don't know if that means anything, but I definitely think it's worth mentioning. That's our story. We've seen other things, but since this is a Dogman story, I'll save those for another time. Just for reference, I live about 30 miles from the land between the lakes. Good night. My name is Anthony Clark, former resident of Wisconsin. No, I don't live in Elkhorn.
But I guess I lived close enough to where these things could migrate. Yes, I have seen the Dogman, and it scared me so much that I moved to an entirely different state to get away from it. I'm a nurse practitioner. I specialize in the emergency room. And the night that I encountered a Dogman, I just happened to be working a double shift because of a car accident. A man came in that had been T-boned, and I wanted to make sure that he was okay. Once he was stabilized and moved into a different room, I could go home, resting assured that he was going to survive. The first thing that struck me odd was that my big, obnoxious Labrador, Anakin, yes, that is a Star Wars reference, wasn't there to greet me like he normally is. Usually, I can see him as I pull up. He slobbers all over me, wagging his tail obnoxiously, excited that I'm finally home and I can give him treats and rub his tummy. But on this night, he wasn't anywhere to be found, which is completely unusual for him. I found him on the back porch, cowering and whining, which is again completely unusual. Usually I'm drenched in saliva and hair by the time I even reach my door. I had to beg him to come in and offer him a treat to get him to calm down. He was whiny and shaky. I just figured something spooked him, but once he was in, he started acting normal. About an hour later, he started acting crazy again, whining and pacing. It just wasn't like him. He'd run to the door and whine like he wanted to go out, but when I opened the door, he'd run away, not wanting anything to do with the outside. About another hour passed. We sat there and we watched a couple of TV shows that I had recorded, and nothing else had happened that was weird. But then I heard a tapping on the window. Not like someone knocking, but maybe fingernails dragging across it. I went to the window and looked out, thinking maybe it was a raccoon or something like that, trying to get some kind of morsel of food. But there was nothing there. Until Anakin started barking. Now, this dog is about 15 pounds overweight. He loves food, he doesn't like to exercise. You throw a ball for him, he looks at it, and then he looks at you, expecting you to go get it for him. This is not a dog that is aggressive or even protective. But on this night, he was just acting weird. I happened to look out the window and catch a glimpse of something that I will never forget. It was big. Probably 9 feet tall. Hell, maybe even more. I'm 6'2". I get made fun of for my profession. People tell me I should be a linebacker, or a bodyguard, or a construction worker. But the vocation I chose was to be a nurse, because I like helping people. But I never forget because I'm a giant compared to everybody else in the ER. This thing looked like it would tower over me. Like it was some kind of giant invading my area that wanted to harm me, probably even kill me. But the height and the size of this thing wasn't even the thing that scared the hell out of me. What really scared me to my bones, scared me to my soul, scared me to the point where I packed everything up within the next month and moved from Wisconsin to Florida. Somewhere where it's cold and snowy to where it's humid and sweaty. What I was looking at was a werewolf. Or at least, it looked like a werewolf. This thing had a giant head, a pointed snout, a big, sweaty nose. Its ears stood straight up, and they moved back and forth like they were trying to hear everything in the area. What I saw opened its jaws, and it had these huge canine teeth. It was furry from head to toe. It looked reddish-brown, with some streaks of black in it. Arms that stretched almost to its knees, and these claws on its hands. It looked like it could take my head off in one swipe. But the thing that really confirmed for me that it was not a man in a suit was the fact that its legs bent backwards, like a dog. Now, I'm not a horror movie junkie, but I do enjoy being scared every once in a while. So I watch your typical vampire movies, paranormal activity, werewolf movies, everything like that. Most of the time, you see a man in a suit, and they can't get the legs right. If a man really is turning into a wolf, you would assume that his legs would go backwards, just like them. But in all your Hollywood bullshit, the legs don't do that. In reality, the thing that I was looking at, that was in my front yard, had legs that bent exactly backwards like a dog. Something that no human could accomplish in some kind of stupid suit. At this point, Anakin was going crazy. He was barking, pacing, he even pissed on my floor. I don't know if he was aggressive or scared shitless, but either way, this is not the type of behavior that my dog ever exhibited. I continued to look out the window, and this thing moved towards the back of my house. I followed him through the bathroom window, couldn't see him, and then I looked out the back porch window, and that's when I saw this thing again, because it tripped my motion sensor light. My backyard is pretty big, and this thing avoided the light as best as it could, but I could still see it there. So I loaded my shotgun and I went to the window, thinking that even if it wouldn't kill it, it would slow it down. I went to the porch and I didn't fire at this thing, because I'm not stupid. This thing looked like a giant on steroids. A couple of slugs, that wasn't going to kill it. Maybe it would slow it down, but most likely it was just going to piss it off. So instead I fired at the ground, hoping that at least the sound would scare this thing off. But it didn't. This thing manned up, slapped its chest, and roared. It roared to the point where I almost pissed myself. Anakin took off into my bedroom. Like I said, he's not the type of dog that's going to defend me. He's the type of dog that needs defending himself. This thing squared up. Looked like it wanted to fight. So what did I do? I closed the door, closed the blinds, grabbed Anakin and hauled ass to my car. We got in and we took off to my parents' house, which is 45 minutes away. When I got there, I banged on the door, not even thinking to call them and giving them a heads up. It's not every night your son, who is petrified, and his dog, who's still pissing all over the place, knocks on your door at 3 o'clock in the morning. My dad, who was very mad that I interrupted his sleep, asked me just what the hell I was doing at his house, and I explained every single thing that I saw. I told him I saw what I thought was a werewolf, or a wolfman, or some kind of jacked up dream. All he did was nod and pour me a drink. He told me, there are legends around here. You hear shit that freaks you out, but until you witness it yourself, you never really think twice about it. He told me he's never seen anything like that, but he has heard from people that have seen some kind of wolf beast that's stalking their home. After that, I couldn't take it anymore. I was so scared that I wouldn't even leave my house after night. Once the moon rose and the sun set, I stayed in my house, or I stayed with my parents. And again, I want to stress just how big I am. I am 6'2". I weigh 370 pounds. I get made fun of for being a nurse, because I should be out there breaking people's necks as some kind of bodyguard. But this thing that I saw rattled me to my core. Because I'm a lifelong bachelor, never had the desire to settle down and start a family. Never had the desire to settle down with a woman. I consider myself a lone wolf, which, after what I saw, really needs some kind of different term. But because I have nothing to hold me back from moving, I packed up all of my shit,
grabbed Anakin, and we moved to Florida, where there's no encounters that I know of from these werewolf creatures, or, now that I research more, this Dogman phenomenon. I read everything I can. I watch everything I can on YouTube. I look everywhere on the internet for these things. And every encounter scares me even more. I'm glad where I am in Miami now. It's too populated, I think, for these things to show themselves. At least for now. But if they do, or if their existence is ever completely revealed, I'm gonna be on the end that says I told you so. I know what I saw. I wasn't hallucinating. I'm in the medical field. I don't do drugs. I hardly even drink. I didn't hallucinate what I saw. These things are out there. They're dangerous. They square up and they try to defend their territory. And one day, someone is going to be unfortunate enough to try to take one of these things on and get eviscerated, maybe even worse. But hopefully, through all of the carnage that I think these things are capable of, their existence is going to be proven once and for all. I hope this story finds you in good health. Thank you for doing what you do, for taking people's stories like mine and putting them out there so people know that these things truly do exist. I pray to God and every other deity out there that wants to listen, that I never ever again encounter something as horrifying as the Dogman that I saw in Wisconsin. Thank you, and good night.
I'm a skeptic of the supernatural, but I believe anything is possible. I don't discount supernatural occurrences if I can't find a logical explanation for them. I've experienced a few incidents I couldn't explain, but what I'm going to tell you about is the number one thing that freaked me out the most. I live in Twin Cities, Minnesota. A lot of people in the cities around me have cabins in either Minnesota or Wisconsin. Our cabin is in Wisconsin, in a small town called Danbury. The cabin is on Long Lake, at the very end of Long Lake Road. Along with the cabin came almost an acre of land that's covered by thick forest. We ended up carving out a trail through the land for ATVs and whatnot. So, about me. I'm an outdoor enthusiast, and I have been forever. I'm 6'4", fit, and have been a hunter since I was like 12 years old. I know my environment, the wildlife, and the forest well, and I'm typically comfortable in the woods. I come from a military family, and I'm trained in multiple forms of combat, armed and unarmed. I also have extensive firearm training, and as a result, I'm fairly confident in my ability to defend myself. I'm not really scared of people. Big predatory animals, on the other hand, like bears, wolves, man-bear-pig, whatever, I'm not a big fan of. This brings me to the weirdness that we experienced. I'm 23 now, but at the time of the incident, I was 16. Even at 16, though, I was a decent hunter and had good common sense. Anyways, I was at the cabin with my cousin and grandparents. It was the middle of summer, probably July, with hot temps and whatnot. My cousin and I were shooting at each other with airsoft guns. We had a full-on battle going on throughout the property, including the woods, which were my stalking grounds. I was wearing my DBUs with face cover and all, as well as head-to-toe camo. Our battle ended up about 100 yards northwest of the cabin into the woods. We ended the war on the main trail and were standing and talking about the events that had transpired. I was still on guard because I always am. It's just something that my family taught me. I suppose I could be considered a tad paranoid. So we were standing there talking when I noticed something moving at our 12 o'clock, about 50 meters out. I got quiet and focused dead ahead, scanning the area. My cousin was still talking, so I shushed him and he shut up. I figured the movement had been just a bird or something, but I still wanted to be cautious. As a joke and to freak him out, I told him that we were being watched. That's when I noticed the woods were dead quiet. No birds chirping. There was no sound. Then I started to think, this only happens when a big predator is around. So I started looking even closer. And that's when I saw it. At my 12 o'clock, it wasn't a bird. It was this large animal. It had reddish-brown fur and almost blended in perfectly until I focused on it. It had long front limbs, but they were arm-like, with what appeared to be formidable claws, and was standing in a kind of slouched-down position against a tree, like it was trying to be stealthy. And I could have sworn that it was only on 2 legs. Turns out, we really were being watched by something. Even though it was standing like that, it was nearly as tall as me. The only reason why I saw it was because of its teeth. I think it was panting or something, because I could see this whitish area, which I assume were the teeth, because it was pretty visible. Its snout appeared to be a tad elongated. I couldn't get a better look because my first thought was, we have to go. I even said that out loud, and my cousin was already freaked out. When I said those words, he bolted up the trail towards the cabin. He nearly left me in the dust because instead of running when he did, I waited a good 3 seconds. I guess I was just being protective over him or something. I was keeping my eye on it until I saw it move. Man, was this thing fast. That's when I ran like hell. I didn't see which way it ran. All I know is I heard it crashing through the woods. My cousin stopped at the shed, which was still 50 meters from the cabin, to wait for me. When I caught up, I just yelled at him, "Go, go, go," and we both bolted to the cabin. We got inside and shut the door. My grandma asked why we looked panicked, and I slammed the door to shut it. I knew they wouldn't believe me, so I just said we saw a bear, and my cousin nodded to agree. Later that night, after my grandparents went to sleep, we talked about it. I asked my cousin if he'd seen it. He told me that he paused for a second to look back after he ran to see if I was running with him. He said that he'd seen me still looking at it, and that's when he saw it move, and I ran. He said he mostly saw just a flash of fur, but it was bulky and tall, and he didn't think it was an animal. He went on to say he thought it wasn't the right color to be a bear. I agreed with that. It wasn't the right color to be one, and I told him we only had black bears in the area, and it wasn't built like a bear either. I told him I never thought it was a bear, and that it was something supernatural that I couldn't explain. He asked why I lied to my grandparents, and I told him they wouldn't have believed us. We kept it between the two of us until now. The animal didn't match any known regional animal profiles in the area. I'm at a loss for what it might have been. I do know it was stalking us, though, and that it was built like an athletic predator. Not like a bear. It wasn't as heavyset as a bear would have been, and I really do think that it was on 2 legs. Throw in all of those details, and I really do think that I saw a Dogman that day. After the incident, neither of us would go into the woods on foot, alone, or without a gun. We generally only went back into the woods on ATVs from that point forwards. I always loved that cabin, up until then. Fortunately, the cabin has been sold now, so I can't even go back out there to explore if I wanted to. Recently, I started sending this encounter out to other people to see what they think. Some people have asked if they think it was the beast of Bray Road, but I've looked it up, and Elkhorn is like 5 hours away from where we saw it. I don't know if it's the same creature, but I guess it could be possible that it's the same species. There's so much forest around here that it'd be easy for something like that to stalk the area and even find a food source. I don't really know, but part of me is curious to find out what it is. The other part of me remembers how scared I was that day and doesn't want anything to do with it. In the early 90s, I grew up in the backwoods of eastern Arkansas, not too far from the Tennessee line. My grandparents lived way out in the sticks, pretty isolated in the same house they raised my mother in and had lived in since they were married back in the early 1900s. They had a small farm, and I spent most of my summers there roaming the property and playing with my cousins. Back behind the house, roughly 20 yards, was a small field that met up with the wood line, roughly another 100 yards away. At the wood line was an old barn and a dog pen that my grandpa kept his hunting dogs in. The barn sat roughly 300 feet from the dog pen, and both were situated right at the wood line with a footpath that ran from the back of the house through the field and directly between them and led deeper behind the house and down to a creek. It was there that I had an experience that forever changed the way I look at the world and gave me a fear of the woods that I have never and will never recover from, and still remember clear as day at 40 years old. It was 1993. I was 13, and my cousin and I had taken the path down to the creek. We liked to do that, and had several times before. We used to hang out down there, and do what kids do. This particular day was sometime in the fall. I'm not sure the date, but if I were to make my best guess, I would say it was late October, because I remember the leaves had turned color and began falling off the trees, leaving them mostly barren skeletal figures compared to the normal greenery of spring and summer months. We had stayed a little longer, and the sun had begun to set as we made our way through the woods back to the house. As we arrived at the barn and the dog pen, we noticed that the dogs were not doing the usual howling and barking and jumping on the fence that they always did, but were more instead all cowered inside the shelter as far away from the front of the pen as possible. The second thing we noticed was the overwhelming smell of urine and rotting flesh, like a dead animal. It was then that we heard a limb break as if stepped on, and that was followed by a loud, extremely deep growl that I could feel in my chest come from the direction of the barn. I spun to look, and what I saw is something that to this day still chills me to the bone. Even in the orange fading sun, I could see this thing perfectly. On the side of the barn that met the wood line stood a creature, some 8 to 9 feet in height. It was half hidden, peering around the corner of the barn at us. Its upper body looked very much humanoid. Its face looked very scary, very much like a jackal or a hyena. The fur was very unkempt looking, reddish, kind of brown looking, with dark spots mixed in. The head and face looked damn near exactly like a hyena, only much larger and scarred up on the left side. Like maybe it fought another one of these things, and it took a swipe at its face, because the ear on the same side was half missing, and the eye on that side looked like it'd been blinded by whatever scarred its face, leaving that eye a milky white color. The other eye, however, was bright yellow. The fur was similar to a hyena too, but a little darker, and it wasn't spotted like them. The dark spots were just kind of mixed in. The stomach hardly had any hair at all, and I could see its genitals. It was male. They looked like a dog's does, sort of, only instead of facing up towards its head, it was facing downwards towards the ground, and actually came out a bit instead of looking like the foreskin was fully connected to the lower abdomen, if that makes any sense at all. It had a very short tail, no more than maybe a foot in length. It looked like it was smiling at us, and all the teeth I could see looked very sharp. Its arm was hanging down by its side, and was very long, almost touching the ground with a hand that had long fingers ending in claws. Its legs looked much like a dog. It looked very, very unfriendly. Horrific, actually. It looked both intelligent and wild at the same time, if that makes any sense at all. I don't think it was feral. If it were, it could have easily caught and killed both of us with no problem. You could see intelligence as it was looking at us, as if it were kicking around the idea of whether it should eat us or not. It stepped from behind the barn, and with a stooped-over posture, started to walk towards us. It was very built and muscular. If I had to guess, I would say it was in excess of 800 pounds. It had reddish-brown fur that was lighter over the abdomen, legs, and arms, and was thicker around the neck like a lion's mane. It was very mangy and unkempt looking. We turned and ran at the speed of light towards the house. It let out this howling scream unlike anything I have ever heard. It actually made my heart skip beats. I didn't turn to look. I just ran. Take the gnarliest werewolf howl you've ever heard in a movie. Amplify it. Throw in Jamie Lee Curtis's screaming in the Halloween movie at the same time, and that still doesn't even do what I heard justice. It was just unearthly. Horrific. I've never heard anything I can even try to compare it to. Mix a Bigfoot howl in with those other two things, and that might be in the ballpark. As we approached the house, my grandpa was coming out of the back with a shotgun. He'd heard the howl. We started to tell him everything, and he just stopped us and said, "I know what it was. Get in the house." And he went towards the barn. We stood on the back porch waiting for him to return. After several minutes, we heard 3 shotgun blasts, followed by what sounded like a bulldozer crashing through the woods, and then that ungodly howl again. My grandpa returned a couple of minutes later. "Stay out of them woods. Don't go back in there anymore. That's its territory," he told us. And that was the end of it. We never talked about it once after that. I tried to bring it up a couple of times, and he would say, "Just don't worry about that. Just stay out of them woods and leave it alone, and it will leave you alone." My grandpa relocated his dog pen up by the house to keep his dogs safe. We never spoke of it again, and I have never been past the backyard since that day. And yes, it was a horrific experience. I've been through a lot of situations, and damn near died more than my fair share of times, and none of it even comes close to the fear that I felt that day. I love your channel, man. My research on what I saw led me to Dogman. Dogman brought me to you and Vic Cundiff. I know a lot of people describe these things as looking exactly like a werewolf from American Werewolf in London, or Van Helsing, or Underworld, but what I saw looked almost exactly like a bipedal hyena. These things exist. Believe me or don't. Thanks for your time, and for sharing my story.
My name is Ronald. I'm 20 years old, and I live in the back skirts of a small town in Wayne County, West Virginia, called Lavalette. Originally, my family and I lived in Jacksonville, Florida, but we moved up here because it was getting too humid for us to handle, and we couldn't deal with all the hurricanes down there. Now, I promise you, what I'm about to tell you is 100% true, and to this day, what I saw was something I will never forget. When it happened, I was in my freshman year at Marshall University, located in Huntington, West Virginia. But I didn't own an apartment to live in at the time, so I had to live with my parents and little brother. This encounter happened on October 27th, 2017, on a Saturday evening. By the time I was driving home, it was already starting to get late. I came upon the one road that leads me straight home, Walnut Gap Road. As I came up to this blind curve, where I can't see who's coming from the opposite direction, I slowed down, just like I normally do, just to make sure nobody was going to fly around the corner. Suddenly, when I slowly drove around that corner, I stopped the car when I saw this thing stepping onto the road on all fours. At first, I thought it was a 500-pound black bear, because we do have some around here. It also looked to be the same size, and had black fur. But when my headlights hit this thing, I realized it wasn't a black bear at all, but something else entirely. It looked like a wolf, but it was way too big to be a wolf, bigger than any wolf I've ever seen before. It had the same pointy ears and long bushy tail, which told me that this couldn't be a black bear, considering bears only have those very tiny tails. At first I was excited. The thought of finally seeing a wolf out in the wild was fascinating. But at that time, something else just seemed off about this encounter. A wolf shouldn't be this big. In fact, the more I thought about it, there shouldn't even be any wolves here in West Virginia anymore. I mean, was the government secretly trying to repopulate wolves in this state? Did some wolves escape a zoo and somehow find their way to this road? Those ideas, however, were immediately shot away when this creature pierced its eyes straight at me. And then, even while inside my car, I could hear what sounded like joints popping loudly. And to my shock, I watched this gigantic wolf creature stand up on its hind legs and place a hand on top of my car's hood.
Yeah, you heard me right. Its hand. By the time it stood up, I got a really good look at it. I'd say it was about 8 feet tall and weighed probably at least 650 pounds. I don't know. Maybe even more. Like I said, it had black fur, and it seemed rather feral. Like a stray animal moving around on streets of the city. It looked very muscular, with broad shoulders and long forearms, and hands that looked almost like a raccoon's hands, with jet black claws at each fingertip. I could see the muscles of this thing very definitively, especially in the headlights. Its chest was slightly puffing in and out each time it took a breath. The hind legs resembled more of a canine. The legs looked like they bent backwards, but as everybody knows, they're just walking on their toes. It had huge paws. But the head is what scared me the most. Its head was like that of a wolf, or a large German shepherd, but bigger in proportion. It had a long muzzle, with a sort of pointed nose, and these great big fangs gouging out from the front. It looked kind of like a saber-toothed cat. At least, the fangs did. The rest of it just looked like a werewolf. It had long, pointed ears with tufts of fur standing at the ends of them. But the eyes are the one thing, more than anything, that I will never ever forget. They were an amber yellowish color, and the way they were looking at me, I felt as if they were piercing into my soul. Instantly, I froze in fear, as if I wasn't already afraid enough. My heart was in my mouth, and beating 1,000,000 miles an hour. You know that feeling that even though you know you're an apex predator, you feel very vulnerable in the eyes of such a beast like this? That's exactly how I felt when this thing looked at me. We're top of the food chain? Hell no, we're not. Not to this thing. I knew that this thing was the apex predator, and I was its prey. And I knew that it knew that I knew. This creature could tear up my car with me inside of it. It could have tore the car door and pulled me out. Even if I tried to escape and run as fast as I could, I knew this thing could outrun me instantly and catch up to me. It could have ripped me to pieces and eaten my remains, and I would never be found again. Even if I screamed for help, nothing would help me. I honestly thought that night that I was going to die. That I was never going to see my family and friends again. That I was about to be eaten alive by a predatory creature that I never knew existed until now, and there was nothing that I could do about it. Fortunately for me, that never happened. It was as if God was watching over me that night. That creature instead let out a monstrous snarl, took its hand off the hood of my car, and then walked on 2 legs to the other side of the road. And it did it in only 2 strides. And then, like a ghostly phantom, it disappeared into the darkness without making a sound. But not before turning around to take one last look at me. When that happened, I could have sworn it wasn't alone, because that's when I saw several more pairs of glowing amber eyes staring right at me. I knew instantly that if one of these things is intimidating enough, just imagine what it was like to run into a whole pack of them. With that terrifying thought in mind, I finally snapped out of my daze, and I decided to get the hell out of there. I finally slammed my foot on top of the accelerator and drove my car out of there like a bat out of hell, and got home in literally 1 minute. At the time I got home, I was in tears. I've never felt like that scared. I've never been that scared in my entire life. And it was the first time I've cried like that in a long time. I told my family about what I saw, but of course none of them believed me. My parents, they just assumed I was merely faking the incident to make them believe me, and my brother was constantly harassing me about it. But at least they were concerned when they saw the tears. At that point in my life, I shut out everyone. Every single person I knew to the point where I isolated myself in my own bedroom. I guess I still kind of do that today. And since then, I've never told anyone about my encounter ever again. I mean, who was gonna believe I actually saw not one, not two, but a whole damn pack of real-life werewolves? Eventually, I opened myself back into the social life, and I've been spending time with my family and friends again. But at that time, all I could do was intense research to explain what I'd seen that night. And that's when I discovered the Dogman phenomenon for the first time. According to all the eyewitnesses that I've read about and listened to, they described the exact same thing that I saw. And then I found your channel. I saw you narrating the many terrifying experiences your creatures of the night had with these dogmen. And it made me happy and relieved that I wasn't alone. That there's other people out there who agree to this day that what they saw and that what I saw was real.
Hello, I'm Robert, and I'm so glad I came across your channel. I love it. Well, I have two events that happened to me years apart, but both absolutely terrified and scared me for life. First off, I'm 45 now, and both happened years ago, so I don't know if you or the other listeners find older stories interesting, but I'll let you decide. Second, I'm not a storyteller, or one who looks for attention, but I've held this in for years out of fear and ridicule. Only 4 others know about it. My 3 buddies that shared the first experience with me when we were 13 or 14, and my ex-brother-in-law, who was my best friend for about 15 years. The first one happened back in about 1986. There were 3 of us, and we were best buds. Everyone called us the 3 Musketeers. It was me, Donnie, and Lee. Me and Donnie grew up in the woods, or in a boat, always outdoors, hunting or fishing or camping. So when we got to be 9 or 10, every weekend we were camping in my grandpa's land here in Louisiana, which is where I lived with my mom and pap. We each had pellet guns and would shine for coons or possums or rabbits at night. We also liked trapping, and would set my pa's old steel traps out for whatever we could catch. Then, go build a fire, set up camp, and sit around and talk about whatever 14-year-olds talk about, while the traps soaked up, as my pa would say. One night after dark, maybe 10 or 11 o'clock, we were getting ready to go check the traps, when out of the dark came the most horrifying scream ever. Like a dog that's hurt real bad, or scared. I don't know how to explain it any other way. I know it scared the piss out of us. Lee, literally. We had this shelter we built. It was between 3 trees, and old 2x4s and plywood held it together. We ran into there fast, grabbed our guns, and got ready for whatever was there. But we didn't hear anything else. We just sat there, huddled in that ragged little box we built, like 3 roaches hiding from the light. It was probably 2 or 3 hours just listening. I'm not sure. But there was nothing after that. Even though by this point, Lee was crying because he was so scared. And I'm not far behind him. Whatever made that noise was just that terrifying. We kept asking each other, what do we do? What do we do? Until I couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't stand to see my little buddy crying and shaking anymore. So I tell Donnie I'm going to take the lantern and try to make it the 14 acres up to the house and get my pa to come back with the truck to pick them up. I was the protector in school. I was the protector at the bowling alley and everywhere else we went because I was so big for my age and I played football. I was probably 5'11", maybe 6 feet then. Now I'm 6'5", 280 pounds, so I think that's close anyway, and how I got my courage up. I had a lot of help. Then I stepped out and grabbed the lantern, and started walking. Now I'd gone, I guess, 50 to 60 yards away from them, and the fire, and I'm walking fast, but not running. I didn't want to act scared or show fear in case that thing was still out there. I just think I didn't want anything to know that I knew something was around, if that makes any sense. And I definitely didn't want to show fear. So I'm walking, and I hear leaves crunching on my right at the wood line next to the trail. There's a barbed wire fence there, and then immediately after that there's trees. These leaves are crunching, so I stop, and then whatever was following me stopped too.
So I turn and hold up the lantern towards the woods, and I see nothing. But I know something's there, and that it was pacing me as I walked. So I start walking again, and go a couple of steps, and hear it again. Every time I step, it steps. When I stop, it stops. This went for about 13 of those 14 acres. By now, I'm scared out of my mind, but I won't turn and look again. I guess I was just scared of what I'd see, or if I saw it, it would pounce on me. Then, this thing gets faster, and acted like it didn't care if I knew it was there anymore. It was stepping on sticks, and I could hear it breathing now, kind of like this deep rumble breath, like a lion or something. At this point, I decided that I wasn't going to make it to the house, because the closer I got now, the more aggressive this thing got, and it sounded like it was breathing and walking faster. So I clicked off my safety on my Benjamin pump, and I decided I was going to put a .22 caliber pellet in it. If it was going to get me, I was going out with a fight. I gathered all of my courage and slowly turned and raised the lantern. And there, to my horror, there was these bright red glowing eyes staring at me, about 2 or 3 feet taller than me, and about 15 yards away. The whole time that it paced me, it was waiting where the trail came closest to the wood line. Now I know why it waited, because at this point, it was the closest to me that it could be, without showing itself. I dropped the lantern and the gun, and turned and ran as fast as I could back into the house. When I took off, so did this thing, and it was right behind me in hot pursuit. I looked back once again when I got to the gate by my house, and there, standing next to the barn, were those red glowing eyes, and now I could make out the silhouette of a dark shape that resembled something that looked like a werewolf, standing on 2 legs. I couldn't tell much from the dark, but for a second I watched it, and it glared at me. It was big and dark-colored, with a dog-like head. So I run inside, out of breath, scared out of my mind, and Pa says, "What's wrong, son? What's wrong?" I couldn't tell him what I'd seen. He'd have thought I was making it up, or just spooked. I just said there was some mean wild dog, or something like that, stalking us back there, and it chased me up here. So he got his shotgun, and we went out to the boys. He wanted to look around for a bit, but I begged him not to. I just wanted everyone in the house, because I knew something big and bad was close by, and for all I knew, it wanted to make us its next meal. We never camped back there again. I, to this day, will not go back there in that field after dark. That's my first story. I'll send you the other one once I talk to my brother-in-law, and we figure out how to explain it best. But for now, this story will have to do. Thanks again for listening. Robert in Louisiana.